Hey everybody, welcome to the Kind Faith Podcast for the weekend. Really excited that you're here. It was so great having Tyler last week. We love it and love Tyler and his family and are so thankful that they're a part of the community. Hey, we're diving into the end of Mark chapter 9. It feels like it goes on forever. There's a whole lot of verses in Mark chapter 9. This week we're going to take verses 30 to 37. And even with 37 verses, we're not done. We got more coming. I want to lead off with this question, though. It's kind of a confessional question for you to answer, and I don't want you to answer out loud. But do you ever find yourself acting childish? Or at least feeling childish? Don't answer out loud. My suspicion is that the vast majority of us have childish moments in us. And I know I do. I guess I should start with my personal confession because, of course, I'm leading this off. I definitely get pouty. I definitely have many temper tantrums. I just find myself grumpy, especially when I'm doing some kind of project and things should go together better and more easily. And then I have to run to Home Depot again. And oh my gosh, I act like a little baby. What's your response when you're childish? When you're childish, my guess is, like me, you think, wait a second, I'm not acting my age. I'm not feeling the emotions of my age. I'm not behaving of my age. Shame on me. Well, there's good news in the passage today. There's good news for the childish among you. In fact, if some of you are standing there saying, well, I'm never childish, good for you. And you get to listen in, but this sermon really won't be for you. This sermon is really for everyone who finds themselves in a childish place, emotionally or behaviorally. So we're going to dive in to the passage. It is Mark chapter 9, verse 30, and we're going to read through verse 37. So they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down, and he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me, the Father. That's the story. And here's how I got to this childish piece at the beginning. I got thrown for a loop because this story starts out with this incredible statement about Jesus's purpose on earth to die and rise again. And he instructs the disciples. And then they get in an argument on the road about who's greatest. There's a conversation about servant leadership. And then seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus decides that taking a child and putting the child up on his lap and wrapping the child up in his arms would be the perfect way to illustrate what he wanted the disciples to know and understand. So what was that? What did he want the disciples to know and understand? And why was there a child at the end of this story as Jesus wraps up his teaching with the disciples? Well, it's because the disciples were being childish. And Jesus pulls the child up on his lap as a visible illustration of the disciples. This passage is not setting up the ideal that we would be like children receiving the kingdom. That comes later. That's a different teaching. That's not the sermon for this passage. Jesus has said to them pretty clearly when he brings that kid up onto his lap, you have been acting like children. And here's why that's good news. Look at how Jesus deals with the childish. The first section of this passage is really fascinating. I mean, listen to the first sentence of verse 31. It says, they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. And then in verse 31, for he was teaching his disciples. Do you catch how cool that is? Here are disciples of Jesus who've been called out to get special attention from the Messiah, from Jesus. Special attention is given to childish ones of Jesus. That seems mind-blowing to me, and it's confirmed by the fact that he delivers this teaching, which is pretty straightforward. Look, guys, I'm going to be handed over to men, I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise again after 3 days. Now, I get the and rise again is a little bit confusing, but the words all fit together pretty clearly. It's pretty simple what's going on. But how do the disciples respond? They kind of respond in a childish way. They did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. I mean, this is Jesus who, when they didn't understand the parable of the sower, they said, please explain. And he explained. And when they didn't understand just a few verses earlier why they couldn't cast out the demon from the plagued boy, then Jesus explains it to them. They've been explained, they've had difficult things explained to them, but here they operate with a level of fear. But in it all, here's what's good news for us who sometimes are childish. God will take us aside and specially teach us, specially give us attention, because we are his children. We're his disciples, his sheep, and God pulls us aside and teaches us uniquely in a way that he doesn't teach the rest of the world. What's something that Jesus has uniquely been teaching you? I'm guessing that there's things that Jesus has been whispering in your ear and talking to you about that aren't universal principles. They're actually specific to your story as it merges with his story. And maybe no one else can fully understand it. But maybe it is understandable to the rest of the world. But either way, God takes us as his children, even in our childishness. And instead of passing judgment on us, he gives us special attention. God is giving you special attention. I think that's so profound. Because when I'm childish, when I am judging myself for acting immaturely and poorly, I heap on myself shame, I heap on myself embarrassment, I begin to search out who I need to apologize to. That's my response. I try to be adult about being childish. And one of the things I never ever do is look out for Jesus uniquely showing up to me in my childish moment and being with me. I love the grace of that. I just need to accept the grace of that. I hope you will too. The story goes on. They come to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? I love this too. Not only when the disciples were childish in their understanding and childish in their ability to apprehend or comprehend what God is teaching them, does Jesus give them special attention. But now, when there is something that deserves rebuke, Jesus waits until they are in the house. He doesn't call them out publicly. He honors their dignity. He respects them, even though they were acting childish on the road, and in private, he calls them out. I love this because the grace God gives when we're childish. When you're childish next, listen for the voice of God quietly, not publicly, calling out your childish behavior. Because that's the way God came to his disciples. That is how God came to his people all through history, right? When his people were straying, what did God do? He sent the personal voice of a prophet to individuals or to specific people and called them out. It became public because we wrote it down. But the beautiful grace in it was God specifically came, instead of delivering a universal and global for all to hear, megaphoned out to the world rebuke, God comes in and quietly draws his disciples to himself within the four walls of a house, within the four walls of Israel, within the four borders of the promised land, and calls them out. So have you been childish? I'm guessing that in your childishness, that God has come to you to specifically teach you, and God has privately engaged in drawing you near to himself. But here's the second piece of great news, or maybe it's the third. I think it's the third if you're counting. The third piece of good news in this passage. He says, what were you discussing on the way? Knowing full well what they discussed on the way, but they kept silent on the way, for they had argued with one another who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last, the servant of all. It was the whole point of the private teaching he gave them just a few verses earlier, that the Son of Man, the one who is first, from whom all things were created, became the servant of all. And so you are too, but here's the good news. Here's the point. Not only does he give special attention to his children, and even when we're acting childish, and not only does he come and draw us close within the four walls to speak to us, instead of making our shame public when we're acting childish, he calls the childish to become mature. He doesn't leave us where we're at. He doesn't say, oh, just, keep on being childish. He actually calls us to a level of maturity. And what is that level of maturity? I think the whole Christian call can be summarized in this verse 35. In fact, if there's a verse to memorize, this is it. If anyone would be first, he must be last of all, the servant of all. Why is that? That is the heart of the Christian journey, right? Remember 1 Corinthians 13? I can do all these great things, and I can have a great speaking voice, and I can do great miracles, but if I have not love, and then he goes into what is love. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not pursue its own way, and on it goes. What is that? If that isn't putting yourself last. And think of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, verse 22. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. The only one in there that I don't think is self-sacrificial may be joy, but a great argument could be made that even joy requires self-sacrifice. So this whole idea of what God is creating us and making us to be is in this passage. So Jesus comes to the children, the childish, us, and says, I want you to mature. I want to give you this special teaching. I don't want to shame you publicly. I want to draw you within the four walls and close to me. But here's the lesson. If anyone would come after me, if anybody would be first, he must be last. He must be the servant of all. And then he takes the child and puts him in the midst of them, takes him in his arms, and says, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And why receive this child? What's behind that phrase, receive. What's behind that phrase, receive, is not just to sit the kid on your lap. It is to give that child your attention, your resource, your time, and your energy. What does that require? Servanthood. I remember when we were contemplating the arrival of Caleb. Marcy was pregnant, and I think I've shared this before. I thought of myself in that time that I was pretty ready to be a dad. You know, I'd been a youth pastor for a long time. I understood self-sacrifice. I knew it was going to be difficult. I was convinced I had the parenting skills. And then Caleb showed up. And my great lesson was, I think I might be the most selfish human being on the planet. I just saw in myself this reality that I wanted the world to revolve around me. I didn't even realize that that's what I wanted, but that's how I acted. And I got frustrated, and boy, not only did I have an infant who cried, but there was an adult male in the house who was arguably more childish than the infant. It was so hard to learn how to become last, to become the servant of all. Where in your life is God calling you to be last? Where in your life is God calling you to be the servant of all? Not a servant of some, by the way. The servant of all. Where in your life is God calling you to do that? This is so complex, right? Because we don't have the same kind of structures that we could see in the Old Testament, where there were slaves doing bidding, there was work to do. And I think to myself, well, I'm a pretty good servant in my household. We have a good partnership. I make the meals half the time. Caleb does the dishes, but I do dishes every now and then. And I'm really self-sacrificial. Am I? Are we? Are you as good as you've convinced yourself you are? Are you really a servant? Here's the measure of servanthood in this passage. The disciples are having this argument about who is the greatest. And they're having an argument around ideas, behavior, performance, language, mood, emotions. They're diving into so many pieces of the human experience, and not just who made dinner last night. And Jesus comes to them and says, are you willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to lay down what you think is best for someone else's best? Are you willing to lay down your expectation for someone else's expectation? Are you willing to lay down your hope for someone else's hope? Are you willing to lay down your dreams for someone else's dreams? This is the kind of servanthood Jesus was getting at. And ultimately it was the kind of servanthood that he put on display, right? And that is the cross at the heart of the matter. Jesus lays down hopes, dreams, emotions, expectations, suffers all, endures all as a servant so that we might be served. I am convinced the older I get that I know way less about serving than I thought I did. The older I get, the more I realize I'm less of a servant than I thought I was. And there's more sacrifice of what I think is best. There's more sacrifice of what I think I know. There's more sacrifice of what I think I need. All of those sacrifices are in service to God, and it's an opportunity that God gives me to become more than a child. to actually, in servanthood, receive those who are childish around me. It's crazy self-sacrifice, right? And that's the call of this passage. Good news for those of us who are childish, and a good challenge that we would become servants. So, where in this next week will your servanthood be challenged? And how will you step out and be the servant? I'll say that question again. Where in this coming week will your servanthood be challenged? Where will you be inclined to fight to be right, to put yourself first, to get your dream? And how can you become more of a servant? How can you lay that down and become less childish and more Christ-like? It is a graceful gift, is it not? It sounds like this could be about working to earn things or working to be better. It sounds like this could be a moralistic message, but really it is a grace-filled, honoring message that God says, come on, you can be like me. Let's do it together. So be first by being last. Amen.